March 7, 1945. The west bank of the Rhine River burned beneath a low, cold moon. Artillery flashes rippled across the horizon, lighting broken towns and shattered trees. The air was thick with smoke, the bitter scent of cordite, and the hum of diesel engines idling in the dark. Along the river's edge, American combat engineers crouched in silence. Their boots sank into the mud as they unpacked steel pontoons and bridging planks, the tools of men who built while others destroyed. Across the water, German machine guns fired blindly into the night. Tracer rounds cut bright scars into the mist. The Rhine was more than a river. It was the last wall of Hitler's fortress, wide, fast, and fiercely defended. For months, the Germans believed it could not be crossed under fire. But in those hours, under relentless shelling, the U.S. Army's engineers were about to prove them wrong. Somewhere upstream, near a town called Remagen, a single bridge still stood. And before the sun rose, America's soldiers would do what no one thought possible: bring an army across the Rhine, one plank, one cable, one heartbeat at a time. By March 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing from all directions. To the east, the Red Army was only a few hundred miles from Berlin. To the west, the U.S., British, and Canadian armies had shattered the Siegfried Line and were pushing through the heart of the Rhineland. But despite the victories, one obstacle still loomed before the Allies: the Rhine River. Stretching more than 760 miles from the Swiss Alps to the North Sea, the Rhine had been Germany's natural defense line for centuries. It was broad, fast-flowing, and lined with steep fortified banks. Every bridge across it had been mined, and every crossing point guarded by anti-aircraft guns, artillery, and veteran infantry. For Hitler, it was not just a river. It was a final symbol of the Reich's endurance. A line to be held at any cost. In Allied headquarters, the question was simple but daunting: how do you move an entire army across one of Europe's most dangerous rivers while under fire? The German command expected the answer to take weeks. They imagined the Allies would halt, reorganize, and prepare massive bridging equipment for a slow, deliberate assault. But by 1945, the U.S. Army had learned the value of speed and surprise. Generals like Omar Bradley, Courtney Hodges, and George S. Patton knew momentum was their greatest weapon. Every hour the Germans were given to reorganize meant more blood spilled later. Behind the front lines, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had already begun rehearsing the impossible. They had practiced river crossings in England and France, at night, in fog, and under simulated artillery fire. Using Bailey bridges, pneumatic pontoons, and amphibious vehicles, they had turned engineering into a form of combat art. Still, even the most prepared units knew the Rhine was different. Its current could sweep away tanks. Its far bank was lined with hidden bunkers and camouflaged 88mm guns. And German demolition squads had orders to blow every bridge once the Allies came near. For the German High Command, the Rhine crossings would be a final test of will. For the Americans, it was a race to break through before the Reich could gather itself for one last stand. The stage was set for one of the most daring engineering feats in modern warfare, one that would unfold under shellfire, floodlights, and chaos. In the final weeks before the Rhine crossings, the U.S. Army's engineers became the unsung spearhead of the advance. They weren't frontline infantrymen, yet their mission was every bit as dangerous. Their task was to build bridges faster than the enemy could destroy them, often while standing waist-deep in freezing water bends at the glow of enemy flares, with bullets snapping through the night. By early March, Allied reconnaissance flights had mapped every stretch of the river. Engineers studied aerial photographs, measuring current speeds and identifying possible fording points. They estimated bridge spans down to the inch. Every bolt, cable, and pontoon was pre-counted, loaded, and ready to move the instant orders were given. In their workshops and depots, they refined two key weapons of their trade. The first was the Bailey Bridge, a British invention made of prefabricated steel panels. It could be assembled by hand, with no cranes or heavy equipment, and carry tanks within hours. The second was the M2 pneumatic pontoon bridge, a floating structure that could be expanded across the river while under fire. The ultimate proof of American field engineering. But no design could guarantee survival. The Rhine crossings would take place under relentless German artillery, and the enemy had every advantage of terrain. Hitler had ordered his generals to defend the river to the last man, calling it Germany's sacred line. Elite units of paratroopers, SS infantry, and flak batteries were moved into position, determined to turn the crossing into a slaughter. Despite this, Allied commanders pressed forward. They knew that if they paused, the Germans would reinforce their defenses or destroy the last usable bridges. So, under Eisenhower's broad directive, multiple armies prepared their assaults. The U.S. First Army under General Hodges aimed for Remagen. The Third Army, led by Patton, prepared crossings further south near Oppenheim. The British Second Army, under Montgomery, planned a massive river assault near Wesel in the north. Each force was told the same thing: cross, hold, and expand the bridgehead, no matter the cost. Behind the command posts and maps, thousands of engineers stood ready, men with grease-stained hands and iron nerves, who would soon fall. It's one of the greatest engineering challenges in military history. They didn't know it yet, but the coming days would turn their bridges into legends, and their courage into the foundation of victory itself. The night before the crossings, the Rhine lay silent, a long, dark scar dividing two worlds. On one bank stood the exhausted soldiers of the U.S. First and Third Armies, their boots caked with mud and their uniforms stiff with frost. On the far side, beyond the mist, waited the remnants of Hitler's Western armies, armed and desperate, determined to defend the fatherland to the last. For the men of the U.S. Engineer battalions, it wasn't just another mission. It was a test of nerve, speed, and trust. They had spent months training for this moment, practicing bridge assembly in rain, mud, and river current until every motion became instinct. But no amount of rehearsal could prepare them for what awaited on the Rhine. Each man carried his own fear quietly. They knew that when the operation began, they would be the first exposed, wading into open water under German fire to anchor pontoons, assemble trestles, and secure cables. There was no glory in their work, only precision and endurance. Commanders understood this. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army would cross near Oppenheim, told his engineers bluntly, "We're going to cross the Rhine in one night. I don't care how." It wasn't bravado. It was strategy. Patton's gamble was to move fast, without fanfare, and beat the Germans before they realized what was happening. Meanwhile, further north, General Hodges's First Army approached the town of Remagen, where, by sheer chance, a railway bridge still stood intact. The Ludendorff Bridge would soon become a miracle of timing and nerve. But that story began with the same quiet confidence that ran through every Allied engineer unit. Across the front, teams rehearsed in silence. They memorized the rhythm of bridge assembly. One panel every 60 seconds, every joint secured with a hammer blow that echoed like a heartbeat. Engineers carried folding boats, assault rafts, ropes, and explosives. Each squad knew exactly when and where it would move. The tactical doctrine was simple: surprise, smoke, and speed. Artillery would lay down a massive barrage on the opposite bank, blinding the defenders. Smoke generators would cover the river with a gray shroud. Under that cover, assault boats would carry the first infantry across, followed by engineers dragging pontoon sections and Bailey panels to assemble the bridges. Every move depended on timing. One delay, one broken cable, one sunken pontoon, and the entire crossing could collapse into chaos. Yet the men trusted each other absolutely. They weren't just soldiers, they were craftsmen of war. They also carried the weight of history. Each knew that centuries of European warfare had been decided on rivers like this, where armies either broke through or were broken trying. Now, under dim lanterns and the distant thud of artillery, the U.S. Army prepared to do what Napoleon, Frederick, and Caesar had all feared most: force the Rhine in a single night. The river waited, black and silent, as if holding its breath. Soon, the engineers would move. The U.S. Army's assault on the Rhine wasn't just a show of force. It was a triumph of engineering science and tactical deception. Every component, from the bridge sections to the smoke generators, was part of an intricate choreography designed to outthink the enemy. By 1945, Allied engineers had mastered the art of combat bridging. The Bailey Bridge, a modular steel truss design invented by British engineer Donald Bailey, could be assembled like a giant erector set, each panel locking into place without heat via machinery. U.S. engineers had refined it further, combining speed with mobility. In just hours, they could throw a bridge capable of supporting tanks across a river hundreds of feet wide. But technology alone wouldn't win the crossing. Intelligence and deception mattered just as much. American reconnaissance aircraft photographed every bend of the Rhine. Undercover scouts measured current speed and river depth at night. Meanwhile, psychological operations units broadcast false radio traffic, hinting at crossings far downstream to divert German reserves. The Germans, for their part, still believed in the Rhine's mythic strength. Hitler had ordered every bridge destroyed and every crossing defended to the last man. Propaganda called it the final shield of the Reich. Yet reality told another story. Years of air raids and retreats had shattered the Wehrmacht's coordination. Bridges were blown prematurely. Units were cut off. Ammunition was scarce. Still, the psychological danger remained. Many Allied soldiers had grown up hearing of the Rhine as an impenetrable boundary. The line that had stopped Napoleon in 1814. The frontier of Germany's industrial heart. Crossing it felt like entering a forbidden land. American commanders understood that morale would be as decisive as steel. So, they spoke simply. Patton told his officers, "The sooner we get over the river, the sooner the war will be over." The word spread quietly through the ranks. They didn't need slogans. They needed results. On the ground, engineers faced constant challenges: freezing temperatures, collapsing banks, and constant artillery fire. The river's current was fast and unpredictable. Boats drifted off course. Smokescreens thinned in the wind, exposing the bridge crews. Every movement demanded total concentration. Yet the tempo never broke. The 9th Armored Division, under General Leonard Engemann, demonstrated that success favored those who acted fastest. When scouts reached the town of Remagen and found the Ludendorff Bridge still standing, they radioed the message that would electrify the Allied command. Bridge intact, enemy blowing charges unsuccessful. In that instant, everything changed. What had been an engineering operation became a race against time. Engineers sprinted onto the bridge under direct fire, cutting demolition wires and reinforcing damaged sections with steel plates and timber. Within hours, tanks and infantry were rolling across the Rhine, the first to do so in the entire war. The psychological impact was immense. German radio called it a betrayal of fate. Allied newspapers declared it the bridge too soon, a twist of destiny that turned Hitler's last river defense into a symbol of collapse. Across the front, other engineer units followed suit. Pontoon bridges rose at Oppenheim, Wesel, and Mannheim. Each crossing was a feat of synchronization. Hundreds of men, dozens of vehicles, and thousands of tons of equipment moving as one machine. The Rhine, once thought uncrossable, was falling. Not to brute strength, but to precision, intellect, and willpower. And as dawn broke over the western bank, the war's final great gamble began. The dawn of March 8, 1945, rose gray and cold over the town of Remagen. The air still smelled of cordite and scorched wood from the night before. Through the drifting smoke, the jagged outline of the Ludendorff Bridge stood, battered, blackened, but miraculously intact. For the Americans of the 9th Armored Division, this was a moment that would echo through history. The crossing of the Rhine, the dream of every Allied commander, had suddenly become reality. General Leonard Engelmann's men wasted no time. Tanks of the E-14th Tank Battalion rolled toward the bridge under heavy German fire. Mortar rounds burst against the riverbank. Snipers from the cliffs above picked targets with deadly precision. Yet the column pressed forward. Infantrymen ran between tanks, covering engineers carrying explosive cutters and steel plates. As they reached the bridge, the sound of machine gun fire mixed with the groaning of twisted metal. German engineers had wired the entire span with dynamite. Moments earlier, they detonated the charges. But years of neglect, damp and rushed wiring had saved the Americans. The explosions tore holes in the structure, but failed to bring it down. U.S. engineers raced onto the bridge, defusing remaining charges and reinforcing damaged beams with timber and steel planks. Every second mattered. Above them, artillery from both sides thundered. The bridge shook beneath their boots. Yet the men of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion worked as if possessed. At 3:00 p.m., the first Sherman tank rumbled across. Soldiers watched, holding their breath. The bridge groaned but held. A cheer erupted from the western bank. Muffled, brief, almost disbelieving. Behind the tank came more, jeeps, half-tracks, and streams of infantry. By nightfall, thousands of troops had crossed into Germany proper, the first Allied forces to do so. The Rhine, once hailed as the unbreachable barrier, was no longer a defense line. It had become a highway. Word spread quickly. General Eisenhower called it the most unexpected and fortunate event of the entire campaign. Field Marshal Montgomery, still preparing his own elaborate crossing in the north, was stunned. And in Berlin, Adolf Hitler erupted in fury. Convinced the Remagen officers had failed deliberately, he ordered the arrest of the local commanders and the execution of several engineers responsible for the bridge's defense. But anger could not undo what had happened. The Allied foothold at Remagen widened with every hour. Engineers began constructing pontoon bridges alongside the damaged span to handle the relentless flow of armor and supplies. Air support from P-47 Thunderbolts strafed German positions on the far bank, silencing counterattacks before they could organize. Still, the danger was far from over. The Ludendorff Bridge had taken massive damage. German artillery and Luftwaffe dive bombers targeted it relentlessly, hoping to destroy it before the crossing could be consolidated. Yet, night after night, engineers kept repairing it, welding under fire, bolting steel under bombardment, often by flashlight. For the men who crossed those trembling planks, every second felt like eternity. Yet each crossing brought them deeper into the heart of the Reich and closer to victory. The bridge at Remagen was more than steel and rivets. It was a symbol of momentum. The moment the Allies' war machine crossed from hope to inevitability. By March 9th, German High Command realized the scale of the disaster. The Rhine, the last great natural defense of the Reich, had been breached. Orders went out from Adolf Hitler himself. Destroy the bridge at all costs. The Luftwaffe scrambled every available aircraft. Jet-powered Me-262s, Arado 234 bombers, and waves of Focke-Wulf 190s descended on Remagen in desperate raids. They struck from the clouds, dropping bombs and rockets on the narrow steel span. American anti-aircraft gunners along the western bank filled the sky with black bursts of flak. The roar of engines echoed across the river like a storm. But the engineers below didn't stop. Men from the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion worked day and night, patching damage between attacks. They used steel beams scavenged from wrecked buildings and river debris. Welding torches burned through the smoke, bright against the night. Some men died mid-task, snipers and shrapnel finding them on the girders. But replacements stepped in without hesitation. Every hour, more American units crossed. Within days, nearly 25,000 troops, along with armor, artillery, and supply convoys, had surged across the Rhine. The bridge that had once seemed doomed now carried the weight of a nation's momentum. In Berlin, Hitler's rage grew uncontrollable. He blamed his generals for criminal negligence and demanded executions. General Rudolf Hübner was sent to convene a special court-martial, the so-called Flying Court of Justice. Within hours, 5 German officers responsible for the bridge's defense were found guilty and shot. But it was already too late. On March 14th, German engineers launched V-2 rockets at the bridge, the only time such weapons were used in a tactical frontline capacity. One rocket struck nearby, killing several soldiers, but the span endured again. The Americans called it the bridge that refused to die. Finally, after 10 relentless days, the Ludendorff Bridge succumbed, not to enemy fire, but to exhaustion. On March 17th, at 3:00 p.m., its center section collapsed without warning. Dozens of engineers were thrown into the river below. 28 were killed, many more injured. Yet by that moment, it no longer mattered. By then, 5 new pontoon and Bailey bridges stretched across the Rhine. The American foothold on the east bank was secure. The 1st, 9th, and 3rd armies now surged eastward into Germany, rolling through Siegen, Gießen, and eventually toward Frankfurt. The crossing of the Rhine, long considered a near impossible feat, had become a testament to courage, improvisation, and sheer determination. One engineer later wrote, "We were not heroes. We were builders. But that night, we built a road to the end of the war." The German command coup, Allied only watch as the Allied tide flooded eastward. Unstoppable now, toward the heart of the Reich. The crossing at Remagen was the moment the Third Reich began to collapse, not in theory, but in steel, mud, and blood. When the smoke cleared over Remagen, the Rhine no longer marked the edge of Germany's defenses. It marked their collapse. Within days, the bridge had expanded into a vast zone of control nearly 25 kilometers deep. From there, American forces poured into the German heartland with astonishing speed. The First Army, under General Courtney Hodges, seized nearby towns and supply routes, while General George S. Patton's Third Army, to the south, accelerated its own crossings near Oppenheim. What had begun as a narrow breach soon turned into a flood. By late March, 4 Allied armies were across the Rhine. The Germans had no reserves left. Their divisions were fragments, a mix of Hitler Youth, Volkssturm militia, and exhausted remnants of once proud panzer units. Ammunition was scarce, fuel nearly gone. Many units surrendered en masse rather than fight a hopeless defense. For the Allies, the psychological impact was enormous. The Rhine had stood for centuries as the symbolic heart of Germany, the river of legend, song, and national pride. To cross it under fire shattered the myth of German invincibility once and for all. Even Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Germany's senior commander in the West, admitted privately, "It is over now." Strategically, the crossing opened the door to the Ruhr, Germany's industrial core. Within weeks, the Allies encircled Army Group B in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket, capturing more than 300,000 German troops. Entire divisions disappeared into captivity, their vehicles abandoned, their commanders surrendering by the hundreds. Meanwhile, General Eisenhower's headquarters recognized the broader implication. The Western Front had effectively dissolved. Instead of a single battle line, there were now multiple alliances, the thrusts slicing through Germany's interior, racing toward the Elbe River and beyond. In just 1 month, the Western Allies advanced faster than at any point in the entire European war. The nightmare that had begun with the crossing of the Meuse in 1940, when German panzers swept west through France, was now being reversed, mile by mile. But amid the triumph, the engineers of Remagen carried a different memory. They had paid heavily for their achievement. The 276th and 51st Engineer Battalions recorded dozens of dead and wounded during the 10-day defense of the bridge. Many were buried on the riverbanks they had fought to cross. Their courage had bought the Allies something greater than a bridge. They had bought time, the one resource even the strongest armies can never reclaim. And that time would soon close the circle of the European war. By April 1945, the Allied spearheads were unstoppable. The Rhine crossing at Remagen had opened the floodgates, and now the full weight of the Western Allies surged into Germany. Cities fell in rapid succession: Kassel, Frankfurt, Würzburg, their defenders too few or too demoralized to resist. Patton's armored divisions advanced like a rolling tide, while the British Second Army pressed from the north and the Americans from the south. Within weeks, the two fronts met near the Elbe River, cutting Germany in two. The success at Remagen didn't just quicken the end of the war, it shattered the strategic balance. German generals who had once spoken of fighting a defensive miracle west of the Rhine now watched helplessly as their armies disintegrated. The Ruhr pocket collapsed by mid-April, yielding nearly 317,000 prisoners, including Field Marshal Walter Model, who later took his own life. For the soldiers who had crossed the Ludendorff Bridge, victory came with silence. Many of them had fought from Normandy to the Rhine. They had seen the full arc of the Western Front, from the beaches of France to the broken bridges of Germany. In Remagen, the bridges' remains still lay in the river, twisted metal jutting out of the current, half submerged like the bones of a fallen giant. The U.S. Army erected a simple memorial nearby, dedicated to the engineers who built and rebuilt under fire. One inscription read simply, "To those who built the road to victory." Years later, veterans of the crossing would describe that night, not in terms of heroism, but of necessity. They were builders, welders, and sappers. Ordinary men asked to do the extraordinary. And in doing so, they had brought the war's end into sight. For Germany, the fall of the Rhine line meant the end of any realistic defense. Hitler's dream of an impregnable Reich had drowned in its own river. Within 2 months, Berlin itself would fall, and with it, the Third Reich. Yet history would remember the crossing at Remagen as more than a military success. It was a testament to improvisation, courage, and the sheer will to finish a war that had consumed the world. The road to peace had been built not by generals, but by engineers, working in the firelight of the Rhine. In the fading months of the Second World War, the crossing of the Rhine became more than a military operation. It became a statement of endurance. It proved that even in the final, desperate moments of conflict, human ingenuity could carve a path through chaos. The engineers of Remagen didn't wear the medals of the frontline soldier. They fought not with rifles, but with rivets and steel beams. Yet, under the same shellfire and smoke, they achieved what entire armies had once deemed impossible. Their bridge, built and rebuilt under fire, carried not just tanks and trucks. It carried hope. Hope that the war could be finished, that the killing could end, that the crossing of one last river might lead to peace. For the German command, the loss of the Rhine was more than tactical defeat. It was psychological collapse. The river that had guarded Germany's heart for centuries had been crossed by men who refused to stop building. It marked the moment when destiny itself seemed to shift. In the decades that followed, the ruined towers of the Ludendorff Bridge were left standing on either side of the Rhine. They became silent sentinels, reminders of a night when courage and craftsmanship met under fire. Visitors who came to Remagen saw not just the remnants of war, but the shape of resilience. Every generation since has faced its own rivers, its own walls of fear, doubt, and resistance. The story of those engineers reminds us that even under bombardment, creation can triumph over destruction. That progress, even in war, is built one beam at a time. The Rhine's dark waters still flow beneath those stone towers today. And though the bridge has long since fallen, the spirit that built it endures. A bridge not of steel, but of human resolve. The night the Americans crossed the Rhine was not just a step toward Berlin. It was the night humanity proved once again that no barrier, not even one built of war, can stand forever.